Welcome back to Passing Time with Craig. As always, I'm your host, Craig. Today, I'm passing time with Kevin. Hello, Kevin.
Hey, Craig, how are you today?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Good.
That is fantastic to hear. I'm so excited to have you here. I've got your book in front of me right now, Our Past Matters, Stories of Gay Calgary. You are the author of it. We've got so much to talk about here today. So I think the best thing to start with is, why a book? Why write a book?
Um, I had no intention of becoming a queer historian when I started the project back in 2012, but the history bug just sort of bit me, and I got more and more interested in our community's history, and eventually people started clamoring for a book. I started a website in late 2012 and posted kind of research findings, and it was really well received. And, just when enough people tell you that you should write a book, then you start to think, well, maybe I should do that.
Yeah.
And I have a history of doing freelance writing and freelance journalism. And so I did a Kickstarter in 2014 and thought it would take me a year. And the Kickstarter was successful. I was very, very grateful for the Calgary community to come out like it did. And then it took me 4 years to write. So writing a book was a lot harder than writing a newspaper article or a magazine.
Yeah, it's a lot more undertaking. You can go a lot more words than, an article where they're like, all right, condense it to 500 words or something.
I didn't know where to stop. There's something particularly about writing history where there's always new sources or new interviews to do or new things to learn. And I was revising and revising and revising and not wanting to miss anything and kind of wanting it to be like the perfect history or the complete history or something like that. And then realized I had to let that go.
Yeah.
And then I could get the book done.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too, because you're taking a huge undertaking here, queer history in Calgary in Canada. And you have moments in the book too where you say you don't know exactly the outcome of a trial or something, because especially going back decades when there wasn't a lot, and we also try to just sweep all this under the rug and nobody needs to talk about this. So I like that you acknowledge that.
Well, and I've learned a lot about doing history, that it is incomplete, it is inconclusive sometimes, and that your own version of the truth can sometimes be wrong sometimes. Or that, here's an example, I interviewed different people who were at an event in queer history, and they have different memories of it. So where does the truth lie?
Right.
And I guess I naively assumed before I was a historian that, history was the truth or something like that. So I just understand there's a lot more nuance than I ever realized possible. And to your point, queer history is almost non-existent, sort of in the old historical landscape. So what I'm doing, what other people across the country are doing, are really, doing a reclamation project to try and discover these stories before our elders die in our community,
Yeah. So when you decided to really go into the history, and maybe even before you started the book, but you started writing stuff, you had the website, were you excited to interview our queer elders? And did it become difficult at any times when the stories became harder ones for them to remember and process, and for you to hear as a gay man?
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts about that. One, so I didn't know any elders, and when I started, I did this very cheeky thing, which it seems silly now, but I was age profiling people at Calgary Pride in 2012. If they had gray hair, I'd are you from Calgary? Can I interview you? And really freaked out a lot of people, but eventually broke into that community, and they started trusting me and introducing me to their friends and their friends. And I've grown to really love and admire these people who were such pioneers in our community. That said, there are a couple of surprises for me. I really like the word queer, because I came out in 1990 when the AIDS pandemic was in full swing, and queer was a real rallying cry. And so that's kind of my generation of gay activism. But they really found the word queer a pejorative. It really hurts them still. So
Right.
I actually changed the name of the Calgary Queer History Project to the Calgary Gay History Project to kind of respect their contribution And then the other interesting thing was there were quite a few elders who wanted to be completely off the record. Like, they would tell me their full stories, but I wasn't allowed to use them. So it just kind of became background information for me because they lived lives of concealment and, underground. They were closeted, I guess, deeply closeted.
Yeah.
So they were able to be gay with me or gay in a gay context, gay world, but they didn't want the world at large knowing about it. And they say it's none of their business, but they also wanted to be they wanted to contribute. So it was this weird tension of, disclosure versus concealment with some people.
Right. Because that's something that's still to this day very much. I mean, you talk about it when we were, you get to the point of when it becoming decriminalized in Canada, and there's politicians. I think it was Pierre Elliott Trudeau that was like consenting adults in their bedroom, like whatever. Yes, and there's plenty of people still who their view as being an ally is just, I don't care what people do in their doors, so behind, like, in their bedroom doors. So there still is that, like, we're open, but at the same time they're not as inviting when they say, well, I don't care what you do in your bedroom, just leave it at home.
Yeah, it's always a moving target. And I guess one other thing I'd like to say to that is that as a historian, you really have to kind of imagine what the world was like in a different, and not impose your present day world into the past. Like, for example, I'm middle-aged, and so when I came out, there was a lot of gay bashing on the streets of Calgary, like real violence, like, young men hunting queers with baseball bats kind of stuff. And I think that sort of toughened me up as an individual, like, just because you had to be thick-skinned with the homophobia at large in the Calgary community. Like, the default was to be kind of mean and awful to homosexuals then. And young people now, when I tell that story, it really surprises them. It's hard for them to imagine that, and so I try and, colorfully illustrate that. But at the same time, the generation older than me, like people who are 20, 25 years older than me in their 70s, 80s, and 90s now, like, they lived a life where they went to jail.
Yeah.
Like, the stakes are even so much, and they lived really discriminated, marginalized lives. And so I think it's important that we try and imagine where they're coming from when they say they don't want to be on the record, or they at their funerals eliminate any kind of, like, they kind of de-gay their lives for their family and stuff like that. Like, it comes from their lived experience.
Yeah. So are you born and raised Calgarian?
Yes, I'm a fourth generation Calgarian.
Wow.
So I feel really deeply connected to this place, this city. And I went to the same high school my mom did, and my grandfather and great-grandfather were both bankers in the city. So on the one side of my family, my mom's side, I'm fourth generation.
Wow, that's awesome. So I always like when people can bring stuff together. So, you're fourth generation Calgarian, you love Calgary, this city. So you're also...
You grew up in Calgary?
Yes, I was born in Calgary. I lived a little bit in Victoria as well, growing up, but otherwise, like, Calgary is my home. This is what I always view it as, always have. I just so connected to the city, and I think the city's great, and there's so many great, wonderful people in it, hence one of the reasons for the podcast, and I want to showcase that. So when I found out about your book, I was like, I need to have this, because I think it's so important and so interesting to read about our history here, because sometimes people forget that Calgary has a history. The only history that people think of when it comes to Calgary is probably Calgary Stampede. True.
And energy exploration, like oil and gas.
Yes.
Those are the two narratives we have, but there's many more histories in this city for sure.
Yeah, there's so many stuff. You talk about one guy who you say was known as, like, at one point, like, the most famous homosexual in Canada. Like, there's so much. And then I had no idea about where the Starbucks at the hotel is downtown.
The Pit, the King's Arms Tavern.
No idea about that. Like, it's so interesting to hear and learn all about all the queer folks before me and our generation. Like,
and how old are you?
I'm 34.
Like that. indelicate question on your podcast.
Yeah.
Okay.
How dare you?
What year were you born then?
1990.
1990. Okay, so the year I came out. That's interesting. Okay, so you're one generation younger than me.
Yeah.
I guess 20 years younger than me. So yeah, I mean, lots has changed in your lifetime as well. When you were born, same-sex marriage didn't exist. And in fact, it was illegal to discriminate against people until 1998. And the Alberta government fought that tooth and nail with the Dylan Brain case. And the Supreme Court slapped them down. So yeah, we were at ground zero for a lot of queer activism.
Yeah. Do you feel like that has strengthened you more and more over time, or has there times it makes you feel weaker with so much you've had to battle and witness, and then reading and then interviewing people and seeing everything that happened even before you?
So, I mean, when I came out in 1990, I was a university student, and I, like many people that age in university, like you have a lot of gumption and and AIDS created a lot of anger and kind of, activist chutzpah. And so I really fell into that world and wrote for gay publications back then and wanted to make a difference and wanted to change society. But then, over time I got older and not less passionate, but our human rights struggle, we won all these victories. And then after same-sex marriage, Canadian society really did change and became much more tolerant towards gay people. And, I live a completely out life, and I have a husband and a welcoming family on both sides. So I have a very kind of normal or balanced life. But then when I started doing the history project and reading about the past, it brought up all these emotions that I had forgotten about. It brought me back to my university days where the engineering student society were doing homophobic skits in, public, and all the times I was called fag, on the streets of Calgary, and seeing, so many men in our community that died of AIDS related complications. I found myself a few times actually in tears.
Yeah.
So it surprised me. I'm actually getting a little emotional thinking about it now because, yeah, we went through this really tough stuff and came out the other side. And so I'm so grateful that society has moved on. And I know there's emerging backlashes today that we definitely need to address. But yeah, it's been a journey for sure.
Yeah.
And being a historian kind of resurrects that journey.
Yeah, it's you're not only, you weren't only just reading and writing, but you were interviewing, hearing firsthand stories that sometimes weren't the most positive, or and it can take a lot. So as a historian, and when you're doing stuff like this, and you're going down this path and researching these court cases or gay bashing or anything like that, what do you do before you go to bed at night? Is there something that helps you to, place that in a box and decompress or something?
Yeah, like a chamomile tea and or a bath before bed sometimes is an antidote for a lot of things with bath salts. Yeah, and you have to kind of, in my case, I guess, compartmentalize a little bit, and bring yourself back to the present. And there are a lot of hard things in our past, but there are also a lot of things to celebrate.
Yeah.
And there's this concept in contemporary Canada, North America, about queer joy, which I think is a really lovely idea, and that we should really celebrate positive emotions. And we did that historically too. And in the 70s and 80s and 90s in Calgary, there were so many gay bars and gay coffee shops and gay spaces, partly because we were marginalized in mainstream society, so we had to create our own kind of safe places. But those places were a lot of fun, and there was a lot of camaraderie, and people actually, my generation and older, miss that sense of community that we had. And I talk to young queer people today, and they feel kind of disconnected from community, or isolated, or lonely, whereas, the prime timers or the elders, they're still in each other's pockets and always going for coffee and doing things. And so there was a real strong sense of community that came out of oppression, but also had this like lovely other side to it. So I like that the queer community is now trying to think about positive emotions and not just, be outraged about negative things that are happening.
No, I mean, as a big movie buff, as myself, I know that a lot of us queer folks are starting to be like, okay, it's great when we have these historical dramas and stories of these people that came before us, but they always end in death and tragedy. So it's nice to see movies that are celebrating queer love, and it's just like, it's just a rom-com between two men or two women, and it's just joy, because we have those stories too. As much as we have a lot of sad, we've had to endure a lot and struggle with a lot, we also have a lot of positivity, and we are strong individuals. So it's nice to see those stories as well.
There's a real diversity of queer characters on television and movies today that never used to exist. Like, a queer character in 1985 was, a very sad, marginalized kind of thing, if there was one. And that's been a delightful change in society as well.
Yeah. And I'd like that in your book too, is there's a mix of kind of it's the history. So there are you got these moments where it's just these short stories, and facts about a certain person and something kooky, what they did, or just this bar that they set up. And so I like that it's a nice mix of everything.
Thank you.
So speaking of bars, I wanted to talk to you about that and places, you brought it up as well. And going through this book, not realizing how many queer spaces there were in Calgary. And now we just lost such an iconic place, and you talk about the original like backlot sign, and that moved to the backlot. So we just lost the backlot. We still have Twisted. We've got like Rising Tides up in Bowness. What do you think of the current Calgary queer venue spaces?
Yeah, this is a phenomenon across the world, not just in Calgary. Like, gay people, queer people have sort of melted into the mainstream largely, so they don't need to congregate separately from straights like they used to. But I think there is an important role in gathering people together that are of, one community. Yeah, I mean, I'm now in my 50s, and so, I think there's a life cycle about going to bars. Every weekend when I was 20, 21, I was at Detours, which was a gay bar on 17th Avenue. That was my place. I have really fond memories of dancing and friends and relationships and drinking at those places. And so I kind of feel sad for people who are, 20 now, like what their option, they don't have as many options. Like I picked that place because I liked it better than Boys Town, but some people like Boys Town better. There were like other options as well, and gay restaurants and coffee shops. And yeah, it's been written a lot about, the kind of the death of the gay bar and what it means. You have to remember, we didn't have cell phones or email or anything like that either. Like, it seems crazy to say it today, but
you could connect with people.
That was the community center. It was the way to meet people, friends and future partners and stuff like that. So they fulfilled a whole bunch of different roles that a gay bar doesn't need to fulfill today.
Yeah, I get that, and it's nice. Like there's so many places that host drag shows or have me come in as a queer male and host events, which is fantastic. And I usually try not to like hide the fact that I'm gay. Like I make jokes whenever I can, make people feel at ease. But there's still places that you're not. It's almost as if a lot of them are like, okay, we're cool with you as entertainment, but living your normal lifestyle. I was at Cowboys a long time ago because I haven't been to Cowboys in a while. But I was at Cowboys once, and it was a busy Saturday night, and I started chatting with this guy, and we started to hold hands and kiss, and someone threw a drink at us. The bouncers saw it and kicked them out right away, but there we go. Like, here's a club that should be welcoming to everybody, and there were people there that weren't fond. And luckily, we just had a drink thrown at us. Nothing worse happened, but it happens.
And I'm sorry that happened to you, but the nice thing is the bouncers kicked those people out. A generation before, you would have been kicked out for transgressing. But you're right. There's just because gotten all these human rights victories doesn't mean we've changed everyone's hearts and minds in Canada. And I think there's still some somewhat shocking stats, like 30% or a third of Canadians still do not support same-sex marriage. And, like there's a substantial constituency in Canada that, doesn't affirm our rights to exist or rights to be who we are and love who we love. So it's an ongoing thing. So good for you for being out there. And, visibility really did change the world. And AIDS, as dark as it was, had this silver lining that it made almost everyone activists. Because if you were dying, the stakes couldn't be higher, right? Yeah. So, you couldn't stay in the closet anymore. Everyone knew you were sick. And, yeah, it really transformed. I think it accelerated our human rights journey.
Yeah. So I want to touch on that because, like I said before we started recording, I think that history is so important and we need to learn from it. Otherwise, what is it? If you don't learn from it, you're doomed to repeat. History is doomed to repeat itself. And obviously there's so much going on in the world right now. There has been for a long time. And then, of course, we get to a place where, let's say gays and lesbians are more accepting, but then we're just, people are forgetting about our transgender family and friends, and they're getting pushed aside, but we're still, need to fight for them. But one of the other things that I wanted to touch on, because it was talked about, I'm sure you saw a lot of it on social media, but when the pandemic started, COVID started, and there were a lot of gay guys who just seemed to just kind of push it aside, and we're having a big party still when everything was not allowed. Not necessarily in Calgary. I saw it all over, especially in the States there. And then with monkeypox, it is as if this new generation of gay guys didn't know how big and how important the AIDS epidemic was and what that did to our community. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I know some gay men who, my age and older, who when the COVID pandemic came around, kind of blew it off because AIDS when it began had almost 100% fatality rate. Right. It was like a death sentence to get it. So, when COVID had, I don't know what its rates were, but when 5% of people were getting hospitalized, don't quote me on that number, but it was just as COVID was awful, but it wasn't deadly in the same way. And so I think there was this kind of strange nihilism that came out of that. And to compare and contrast the pandemics, AIDS was sort of ignored by mainstream culture for a long time because it was killing, those undesirables, the homosexuals, the drug users, the prostitutes. We want them in our society anyway, so good riddance. There was people who wrote and said things like that, which is shocking. So it's hard to underscore how impactful AIDS was on the gay community, and how it transformed everything. Up until that point, in the early 80s, the gay men and lesbian community had really fractured on gender lines. They had really different issues they were concerned with. And AIDS actually brought them together. It was a lot of lesbians who staffed AIDS organizations and who volunteered in kind of hospice capacities and really stepped up. And it kind of brought a movement back together and created this real sense of solidarity that pushed the needle forward. But I've interviewed men who are a bit older than me who, in Calgary was a very hard-hit city in Canada. We had over half the AIDS deaths in the province.
Wow.
And I had one guy who told me he went to something like 120 funerals in 18 months, in one 18-month period. And he said some were close friends and more were acquaintances, but he said he sometimes feels like he has this PTSD thing about talking about AIDS or just having gone through, it was like a war thing, where this person dropped Wednesday, that person's dropped Friday, and next week it's, 2 more people and 3 more people. So I guess it's hard to relate to if you didn't experience it, but I think it's important to remember it and commemorate it, and also to contemplate its role in our human rights struggle.
On that note, different things happening, Calgary having, more than half of the AIDS deaths in the province there. You touch on it a lot in the book too. There's moments where you are connecting to bigger things that are happening in Canada, or like I had no idea until I read your book that like the decriminalization of homosexuality was like right around the same time as the Stonewall riots, which changed everything too.
Yeah, that summer of '69 was really pivotal for both Canada and the United States. And I know I've written in articles before, because I've gone back to the archives and read all these newspapers. The debate about decriminalizing homosexuality was like front page news. Like there was tons of editorials in every Canadian newspaper about it. And Stonewall didn't even make it to the Canadian newspaper.
Really?
Like, so there's something interesting about history where one event kind of becomes mythical and grows in stature over time. And Stonewall was a very important event. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there's a lot of different authors of Stonewall who argue about who was important and why, and this and that and the other thing. The world kind of glommed onto it as it's, the day the world changed sort of thing. Whereas we had a very important legal change that then was kind of forgotten in Canada.
Yeah.
So,
and
it's funny how it works.
And it's still like, it's an interesting thing because it's like, oh, well, we decriminalized it. And then, what was the club that then like opened up and the cops were there but
Ourselves.
Yes. Yeah. And then the judge even like threw out the case because it's like, it doesn't matter that they're people, like two men were holding hands. That's not relevant, which I thought was awesome.
That's a good reminder. Even though the law changed, policing didn't change right away, and Canadian society didn't change right away. Like there's still a lot of hatred towards homosexuals in Canadian society in the 70s. But they had this kind of, there was this kind of idea that they were legal now. And that's not quite what the law change was. But yeah, similar to same-sex marriage. Once that changed, then everyone kind of, mainstream Canada just said, oh, right, okay, this is the new normal. We're going forward this way. And so it was really important legal change. Yeah.
Were you confident that you were going to see same-sex marriage get legalized? What was that like for you when that happened?
So, no, I think when I was a young person, I didn't think we'd ever have same-sex marriage. But then I remember agitating for it. So I was with my now husband 7 years before marriage happened. And so I have this funny story, which I tell my friends, that, I was saying, we need same-sex marriage, and then the law changed, and it's like, oh, do I really want to marry him? Like, it was this kind of funny thing. Like, it was just, I wanted the right, theoretically, because I knew I couldn't do it, but then when it changed, but eventually we did get married, so that all ended happily. But, there was something, it was very divisive. I remember going through the debates, I remember donating money to the, equality marriage campaign, and social conservatives in Canada were saying it's going to fundamentally change Canadian society. And the gay community responded, no, it isn't. It's just, if you don't want to marry someone of the same sex, don't marry them. And our argument was that it's just kind of like a very cosmetic change. But in fact, it did change Canadian society, I think. So, they were right. And in a strange, ironic way that, it really changed the channel, I think, in the country, or the tone in the country. That's from my experience of it.
Yeah, it was interesting because I was in high school, and so I was like, "Whoa, this is a game changer. This is gonna be different." And now, like,
a nail biter. Like, it was almost like in the vote in the House of Commons was like it was all the independents who were making it. Like, it was so close.
Yeah.
Like, it could have gone either way.
Yeah.
So.
And now, it just is in our culture, and it's great. Like, I have 4 siblings. One of them is another gay male, and he married his partner. But so my nieces and nephews are growing up with these gay men in their life, and I have a transgender stepsister as well. So they're growing up just as all normal. And sure enough, I remember my one niece when she was like 3 or 4, and she's playing with her Disney figurines and dolls, and they're having a wedding, and she was getting Aladdin and Kristoff for marrying because she just knew that was okay. She didn't think twice about it, and she didn't be like, oh, Mom, I'm making 2 boys get married. It just is normal.
delightful. I really think that's delightful. And it's true, like the next generation, your generation, maybe even younger, like my nieces and nephews are in their early 20s now, like they don't even consider it. Like it's not even an issue. Like it's so mainstream normal for them that which is delightful, really, from where we've come from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did want to quickly touch on, so you have on the cover of the book, and I noticed it's on the wall behind you. Is this?
Yeah, that's the wood block print that was the cover of the book. So it's a Calgary artist, lesbian artist named Lisa Braun, who does these. She's quite a famous Calgary artist. Does these wood block prints, and so she did one of it's a horse, and it's the logo of a carousel horse. It's the logo of Club Carousel, the very first gay club in Calgary.
So
that was.
And why choose that then for the cover?
Well, I maintain that it was sort of, there were some gay places before that, but this was the first one that was sort of run and owned by the gay community for the gay community and became super successful. And it was after the law change, which we just talked about. I think it became like kind of the dawn of the organized gay community. So I see kind of like it being kind of ground zero for all the activists and community builders came out of that space. And it was wildly successful in its first few years, completely underground, and you had to know people to get in and be a member or a guest. And it was the kind of first place that we had for ourselves where the elders called it like, let your hair down. Like you could like leave the straight world behind. And it became a really important, organizing space. And different sister clubs were incorporated in the other prairie cities, and they started to have regional conferences to talk more about human rights stuff, and like just everything kind of flowed out of that. Eventually, commercial gay bars put them out of business, but that was like the next stage of the development of the community. So it was really, really important, and I'm happy to report the City of Calgary made the Club Carousel historic. They put it on the list of historic sites, the registers, and it's where Home and Away is now on First Street, 1207 First Street.
Oh, yes.
And so it was the basement of that club was where Club Carousel was. And Home and Away has actually got a nice little tribute to Club Carousel on the walls.
That's super cool. I'm going to have to look for that next time I'm there. I've been hitting them up. They got a great happy hour.
No, it's and they're very happy to host queer history events. So sometimes I do gay history walks, and we end up there and have a drink, and it's kind of fun to be there with history. And Lois Sabo is one of the founders of Club Carousel, and she's still alive. She's in her late 80s, and she comes out to everything. She's become a really good friend of mine, and the city just also in 2021 named a park after her in the Beltline.
Oh, that's awesome.
So queer history is, starting to become better known and on the landscape.
That's awesome. So, okay, what's your pitch to Calgarians on why they should read this book, whether they're queer or allies?
I think everyone should read the book. Two things. One that we mentioned before, that Calgary's way more interesting and complicated than just the Stampede. And I've had a lot of straight people read this book who grew up in the city, who are like absolutely gobsmacked, astounded that all this stuff was happening, and they had like no idea that there's this whole other world that was sort of right under their noses that they didn't realize. So they find that very kind of intriguing, and that, their lived experience was so disconnected from the queer community. And I just think I'm now more interested in history generally. So I've written another history book that wasn't queer history, and I'm contemplating a third one. And I just think history is so important to what you said earlier about giving context to our world and satisfying curiosity and making us feel connected. So I'm very grateful to the city who've embraced the book so well. It's, it sells really, really well. It's taught at university classes now. One of my favorite things about the book, which I wasn't expecting, was this university connection, and going to undergraduate classes 50 undergraduate students who've read the book, who have really interesting questions about it, and who've grown up in Calgary, some of them, and then like they feel a different connection to their city as a result. So it's been a really heartwarming experience.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I mean, it's even like the city of Calgary does cemetery tours as well, and you can learn about some fascinating people that are in the cemetery. Like there's a lot in the city that and unfortunately, our education system, we have to focus on the world at large, and we spend so much time talking about all these other things, and we don't get to focus so much on our city. And I think it's a real shame, because I think it's very interesting, and people could learn a lot about what came before us here.
Well, and then gives me the thought of the chip that I have on my shoulder, like many Calgarians, about central Canada. And, the queer history narrative in Canada was very Toronto-centric, with some extent Montreal and Vancouver represented. But there were important things that happened in Calgary. And that was sort of that's been my mission, I guess, with the project, is to really amplify Calgary queer history stories and how they were important to the national narrative. And, our activism had different flavors, and our history had different events that all are important and need to be highlighted too. So it was kind of my response to this idea that, Toronto is not the center of the world when it comes to queer history.
So it's so funny you bring that up, because I lived in Toronto for a year, about 6 years ago. And it was very interesting. And I did find that it was, the gay community was, like, there was more there, it seemed anyways. But one of the things I noticed, and why this podcast came to be, is I moved back to Calgary, and everyone was like, oh, it must suck to be back here because there's nothing to do in this city, unlike Toronto. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I wanted to showcase all the awesome people here, all the talented people. There's live music, drag performers, comedians, magicians, business owners. There's so much in this city.
Yeah, I've had the very patronizing experience being in Ottawa or Toronto, where, like, people come to you and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry you live in Cal. How do you do it?" And with this very kind of superior tone. And I mean, I'm a multi-generational Calgarian, and I've made my life here, and it's fine and wonderful. And I always ask these people, sometimes they're queer, if they've ever been to Calgary, and no, they've never. They've just formed this judgment, sight unseen, and I think it's short-sighted.
Yes,
so.
Very much so. As we start to wrap up, Calgary Pride's coming up here. How do you like to celebrate Pride?
Well, I do a bunch of history events, as many as I can. And I also like to see the parade if I can, because I've seen it grown over the years. And for the first time last year, I actually watched the whole parade from start to finish, and it almost killed me. Like, it was 2.5 hours and my feet were so sore. And it was like, how many corporate Calgary, firms can they squish into this parade? It was crazy. And then I like the festival afterwards, and I think I'm going to do a book signing at the Calgary Pride booth this year.
Oh, nice.
Afterwards, and talk to people about history. I like to get out there a little bit, just to have people come up to me, because I always learn things from other people who, maybe haven't contacted the project or gone on a walk. They have a story that I've never heard before that, can put two pieces together, and so I'm just really happy that Pride exists and it's thriving, and, it had a lot of near-death experiences in its own history, and it's doing really, really well right now.
Yeah. So collecting stories, hearing stories, is there going to be a second book?
Well, for a few years after the first book came out, when people asked me about it, I got quite hostile, because it was such a difficult birth, I think I can say. I didn't think it was going to be like that. But now people have been, I shouldn't be so influenced by other people, but they've been saying, we need a second book. And I've started collecting a lot more stories, and I didn't know where to end the first book. And so I ended it in 1998 at the Delwyn Breen case. So there's actually been a lot of history since 1998, right? Like, you're 8.
Yeah.
So you're a full adult now, and lots of stuff has happened, like same-sex marriage. And, so I think, yes, maybe, perhaps leaning towards more likely than less likely.
Nice. Okay, so if people can follow you on Instagram, it's YYC Gay History, is that right?
My handle, and Facebook. Yeah, those are the two social media handles.
Yeah.
Or go to the website. I mean, if you Google Calgary Gay History, it comes right up. And you can subscribe to the website, so whenever we post some new history tidbit, you can get an email.
Nice. I think, like I said, a lot of Calgarians, whether you're queer or just an ally, I think this is important to know about your city history.
You too. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for your interest.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think it's fun to learn stuff that can resonate. Yeah, sometimes it is, as a kid and teen, you're in school and you're like, I don't care what happened in this country in the 1400s. Like, it's not the most thrilling time sometimes, but this is like our actual city and stuff happening, and people that you may pass by on the street could have been one of these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And story is what really connects us. I mean, that's why you like film and television, right? Like, humans have this kind of craving for stories, and history is another version of that.
Yeah. All right. My final question for you. I like to ask all my guests this, and it can be absolutely anything from food, an event, person, but what's awesome?
What's awesome? I think social justice is awesome. I actually think, we are moving forward in a really positive direction, despite backlash, despite wars, like all the things that are happening in our world. I subscribe to this news service called Fix the News, which talks about all these like good news stories which don't get reported in mainstream media because they don't bleed enough. And humanity is making huge strides all over the world in human rights, in environmental protections, in LGBTQ rights, and we don't actually sometimes stop and notice it. So despite all the negative things, and there's a lot of negative things in the world, I think the work that we're doing to move humanity forward is underreported and really important. And I think it's awesome.
That is awesome. That is a great answer. Something friggin' awesome for sure. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for being here today. Our Past Matters, Stories of Gay Calgary. It's a great book. I recommend it to everybody. Check it out. Some of the great local bookstores have it. And then you can follow Kevin social media, YWC Gay History. Just Google Calgary Gay History. It's gonna be easy to find.
Thank you so much for your interest in the book and my stories.
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you all for passing time with me. We'll chat soon. Bye.